Travels and Adventures of Little Baron Trump and His Wonderful Dog Bulgar. Chapter 8. I think we are in our third program. At the first touch of the poisoned food, they fell to the ground as if stricken by a thunderbolt. Again, most sapient and venerable judge, let me add proof to proof that naught of reason dwells within the mind of this faithful creature. I was wounded once in his sight by a treacherous slave. His dagger point pierced my breast, but I smote him dead ere he could find my heart. Yet the danger of that moment seared the image of that poniard forever on this creature's memory. Bid now a retainer turn a dagger towards my breast. It was done. With frantic cries and wild starting eyes, Bulgar strove to leap upon my supposed assailant. Cover now the blade with its sheath. It was done. Again my good Bulgar made desperate efforts to reach the man, filling the room with cries of rage and fear. Cast away both sheath and blade. Was done, but still my beloved Bulgar made maddest effort to protect his master. Cast away the heft and blade and raised the empty sheath against my breast. 'Twas done. Still it was all the same. No matter whether covered or uncovered point, whether harmless heft or still more harmless sheath was turned towards my breast. Bulgar's cries of mingled rage and fear, his mad attempts to break away from the shackles which bound foot to foot, were first and last exactly as fierce. Keen Chop now did several things. He drank some tea. He ordered one of his menials to tickle his ear. He removed his huge spectacles and handed them to an attendant who proceeded to polish them. He then attempted to fall asleep, but at a sign from me, Bulgar began to bark so furiously that he gave a sudden start, as if he thought the animal was about to lay hold of his calves. Taking advantage of this, I strode up in front of Keen Chop, and fixing my gaze upon him, spake as follows. Most ancient magistrate, I crave your gracious consent to add another plea to my defense of this dumb creature. I would be the veriest ingrate whom any wretched outcast might with justice spurn and revile, were I not to defend this devoted being with all my mind's cunning and heart's love. With these words I sprang lightly up the steps which led to Keen Chop's chair, and ere he could say nay, caught up his fan, which he had just laid down on the table beside him. Now, venerable judge, for a last, and I trust overwhelming proof that no evil spirit dwells within that creature's body, here are 2 fans, thine, mine, thine, made sacred by the touch of thy age-palsied and time-stricken hand, mine, a worthless trifle, if it were possible, made still more worthless by the touch of my worthless hand. If, as this court hath charged, an evil spirit dwells in this animal's body, it knows full well that power of life or death hangs on thy lips, that thou canst pardon with a smile or slay with a frown, that thou canst condemn to lingering torture or strike his shackles off with a nod. More that if it should to thine eyes seem meet and wise, thou canst adjudge both master and dog worthy of death, and grant them no greater boon than that their blood shall flow together after life is over, as their love was one when living. Behold, I cast these 2 fans at his feet. Loud murmurs broke out all over the vast assembly. Many rose in their seats and craned their necks to watch the result. Bulgar looked up at me with a puzzled air at first, but his mind was soon made up. He picked up my fan tenderly and carefully, and with wide-opened, love-lit eyes, raised himself on his hind feet, and lay it in my lap, wagging his tail the while, as much as to say, "Never fear, little master, I know what belongs to thee." Then, with an outburst of snarling, barking, and growling, threw himself upon King Chop's fan, shook it savagely until the richly painted covering was torn in shreds, and lay scattered about, tossed it up in the air only to leap upon it with all fours as it touched the floor, and then, setting his stout claws in its joints, wrenched them asunder as if they were made of paper. But this was not all. To complete the list of indignities which he had visited upon King Chop's property, he now turned his back toward that grave magistrate, and by several sudden and vigorous kicks with his hind feet, sent the sticks in a shower flying so close to his head that one actually struck against the huge disc of glass placed in front of King Chop's right eye. But a court officer who had fallen sound asleep and let his head fall backward did not escape so luckily. 2 of the largest sticks entered his nostrils and remained sticking there like arrows in a target. The man awoke with an ear-piercing shriek, in spite of the commands of the court officers that every one who laughed should be bastinode. There was suppressed giggling here and there. King Chop himself twisted his face into the most comical grimaces in order to keep from bursting out into a fit of laughter. As for Bulgar, he was beside himself with pleasure. In fact, he fairly howled with joy. King Chop now moved his thumb as a sign that he was about to speak, and a deep silence fell upon the multitude. I was summoned to approach the steps of the judge's chair. He spake as follows: "When thou art taller, thou wilt be stronger. When thou art older, thou wilt be wiser. Know then that, as the abject slave of the child of the sun, him of the sacred countenance, lord of all the orders, I had intended to dismiss this charge against thy dog, cast off his manacles, and set him free. But it may not now be done. Thy pleading hath convinced me that he doth deserve to die. A just cause needeth no other defense than words. But thou hast pleaded with hands and legs and feet. Thou hast been over earnest. 'Tis proof thou knewest the weakness of thy cause. Hadst thou not spoken at all, and had thy dog himself but opened his mouth, opened, is that what's supposed to be there? At the very outset, what had fallen therefrom would have freed him from his shackles. Now he must die. Let him be delivered to the public executioner." And then, with a motion of his hand, he ordered the gongs to beat, so that it was impossible for me to make reply. The great chamber was now the scene of the wildest hubbub. The guards crowded around me as if they feared I might, in my desperation, sacrifice my life in attempting to rescue Bulgar. Poor Bulgar! He had been quickly lifted into his wicker cage and borne out of the courtroom. Although I could feel my heart hammering on my ribs, I gave no sign of the storm of emotion that was sweeping over my inward being. I could hear those terrible words, "public executioner," ringing in my ears, but my infallible second sight caught no glimpse of that dreadful officer, and hence I felt that there was still hope. But I moved neither hand nor foot. The gongs ceased beating. The throng departed from the Hall of Justice. The guards, kowtowing, backed out of my presence. I stood there alone in that vast, silent chamber. I was aroused at last from my deep reverie by the approach of a messenger from King Chop. He thus addressed me: "The wretched little misshapen King Chop humbly begs the tall and stately stranger to drink tea with him in his private apartment." Mechanically, I followed the judge's servant, who led me through long and winding corridors. King Chop had laid off his huge spectacles and received me most graciously. All the servants were dismissed. We sipped our tea in silence for a while. At length, rising and stepping behind a screen, he returned bearing a huge volume. It was the record of Bulgar's trial. He desired me to examine it while he refreshed himself after his long sitting on the judge's bench with a short nap. I turned the leaves of the record over slowly. Not only were my words set down with the most perfect accuracy, but correct drawings of the various scenes filled the broad margins of the record. On the last page, I noticed that a blank space had been left between the words must and die, and him and be delivered. "'Tis miraculous," exclaimed Keen Chop, starting up and rubbing his eyes. "What a wonderful creature is thy dog. As I slept, I dreamt that he opened his mouth, and what fell therefrom convinced me of his innocence. Let him be brought into your august presence, O just judge," I replied. In a few moments, Bulgar's wicker house was deposited on the floor, and he was lifted gently out of it. I could only with the greatest exertion keep back the tears as his large, speaking eyes were turned full upon me as if to ask, "When will all this mystery come to an end, little master?" I stroked his head with a loving hand to assure him that all was right. No sooner were the attendants out of the apartment than, taking the purse of gold, which Bulgar had picked up on the beach and restored to me, I placed it in his mouth and made a sign for him to carry it to Keen Chop, who now resumed his huge spectacles and sat poring over the pages of the record of Bulgar's trial. Bulgar did not wait for a second bidding. Making straight for Keen Chop, he raised himself on his hind feet and dropped the purse in that dignitary's lap. "'Tis wonderful, 'tis very wonderful," cried Keen Chop, testing the weight of the purse, with a pleased expression of countenance, first in one hand and then in the other. Thy speech was silvern, but his silence is golden. 'Twere a crime to part two such faithful hearts. Go in peace." "But the record of the trial?" I asked. Keen Chop spoke not, but turning to the last page, he laid his finger on the place where the blank spaces had been left. They were now both filled. The word "not" had been written in each of them. The guards were now summoned, and in a few moments the shackles were loosened from Bulgar's feet. Upon finding himself free once more, he leapt into my lap with a wild cry of joy and covered my hands and face with caresses. I could not keep the tears back. Clasping the faithful animal convulsively in my arms, I wept like a child. But a cloud came over my joy, for Keen Chop, upon my request for a safe conduct to the nearest seaport, informed me that he was powerless to grant my request, that I must apply to Slim Lim, the Ta'utai, our imperial governor of the province, lord of the peacock feather, knight of the plain red button, etc., etc. "'Tis well," I exclaimed. "Deign to send one of thy servants to conduct me into the presence of his honor, the Ta'utai." I pined to set foot once more on my native strand. I longed to put an end to the sorrowful anxiety of my parents. Keen Chop shook his head and smiled sadly. "Know, O honored guest," said he, "that no one may approach the Ta'utai, lord of the peacock feather, unless, in answer to most humble petition of 20 pages length, his high and mighty lordship deign to accord an audience. To attempt to do otherwise might mean death at the hands of the guards, but would most surely mean imprisonment in the deepest dungeon of the imperial fortress." "So be it," I replied. "Come death, come imprisonment, I stand this day in the presence of Slim Lim, the Ta'utai, knight of the plain red button and lord of the peacock feather." Keen Chop groaned loud and deep, but seeing that I was resolved to set out at once for the governor's palace, he sent one of his attendants to conduct me to the gate, instructing him, in case of the guards raised their swords to slay me, to cry out in a loud voice that I was a harmless lunatic and had escaped from my keepers. To end all opposition, I consented to this, whereupon Keen Chop bade me an affectionate adieu, and followed by my faithful Bulgar, I turned my steps towards the palace of the Ta'utai. To tell the truth, chaos reigned within my mind. In as many seconds, 20 different plans of action occupied my thoughts. How shall Bulgar and I overcome the opposition of armed guards? It will be madness to provoke them to use their weapons upon us. If I am fated to stand in the presence of the Lord Ta'utai, it must be accomplished by ruse and stratagem. Luckily for me, the shades of night now began to fall, for although the gateway and corridors of the governor's palace might be illumined by 10,000 lanterns, as in truth I found them to be when I reached them, yet the light they shed was soft and uncertain, counting upon the almost lightning celerity of my movements and the utterly noiselessness of my footsteps. I succeeded quite easily in flitting by the group of sentries who were stationed at the outer gate. Delighted with my good fortune, I sprang lightly up the steps of the portico, and closely followed by Bulgar, strode into the main corridor with dignified mien and stately air. 8 towering fellows, armed with savage-looking pikes, for one of whom it would have been no more trouble to spit me and toss me out of the window than for a boy to impale a frog on the end of his pointed stick and toss it on dry land, now blocked my advance. So noiseless had been my step that I had approached within a few feet of them before they became aware of my presence. Had I dropped from the clouds, their astonishment could not have been greater and more ludicrous to behold. They clutched each other by the arm, leveled their index fingers at me, and whispered in a hoarse voice as one man, "A little devil." "Nay, my good men," I replied with the most gracious smile, "not a little devil, but a soldier like yourselves, one who has fought 'neath many skies, knows what a good sword is, what good wine is, would rather fight than run, can tell a good story, and loves war as a hunter loves the chase." The 8 men looked at each other, tapped their foreheads significantly, and then fixed their gaze upon me as if they were in doubt whether my next move would be to jump down their throats, vanish into thin air, or expand into an awful ogre and gulp them all down without pepper or salt. "Come, comrades," I called out in a careless tone, "lay aside your pikes, and I'll show you something that I picked up on a battlefield in the war against the Algerines, something so curious that if you had not slept a wink for 3 months and a day, you would still be willing to keep awake and examine it." Like the Hellraiser movies, right? Saying this, I drew my musical snuff box out of my pocket, and tapping its lid mysteriously, tiptoed my way towards the outside entrance of the corridor, and beckoned them to follow me. They did so with the most comical expression of half wonder and half curiosity depicted on their faces, but first they quietly set their grim-looking pikes in the rack against the wall, motioning them to lay their heads together and bend down so that they could see and hear, for I reached about up to their girdles. I touched the spring of the snuff box, and it began to play. It is impossible for me to give you any idea of the delight which shone upon their great, round, smooth faces. Their mouths fell open. Their fingers twitched nervously as if they longed to touch the little wonder, and yet dared not. I felt now that the moment had arrived for me to act. Winding up the snuff box to its utmost limit, I thrust it into the hands of one of the guards, who seemed beside himself with joy, and showed him how to touch the secret spring. As the music began again, they closed up their group so tightly that even if I had wished to remain one of the circle, it would have been an impossibility. To my infinite satisfaction, they now seemed to dismiss me most unceremoniously from their society. More quickly than it takes to tell it, I drew a ball of strong twine from my pocket, and fastening the ends of their queues securely together, I retreated to the outside entrance of the palace and placed the other end of the string between Bulgar's teeth, with a motion that meant, "Stand fast and pull hard." In another instant, I had passed the group of guards and was making for the door of the audience chamber. Suddenly, the enormity of their negligence dawns upon them. They look up, They see me already at the end of the corridor. They drop the enchanted box, which has decoyed them from the path of duty. They start towards their pikes. Some mysterious force holds them chained to the floor. Bulgar is doing splendid work. My hand is on the door of the audience chamber. Smitten with a superstitious dread of some unseen power, the guards stand rooted to the spot. A low whistle tells Bulgar that his task is complete. He flashes through the corridor like a spirit. We enter the vestibule of the audience chamber. We pass through the outer apartment. We stand in the presence of Slim Lim, Lord of the Peacock Feather. Slim Lim was at home. He was seated in the center of the spacious apartment, sipping a cup of very fragrant tea, the aroma of which was so fascinating that I paused and inhaled it with all the gusto of a fine taster. Two ladies, clad in robes of great beauty and richness, were busy brewing tea and spreading before the Lord Ta'utai an infinite number of delicate viands and toothsome tidbits. But he ate nothing. He was evidently somewhat disturbed by my sudden appearance, and I could see that one thought, to the exclusion of all others, was occupying his mind. It was, how did this stranger pass the guards? True, he is small, but if he can calmly walk into my apartment, why may not an evil-disposed person do likewise? Determined to convince Slim Lim and the ladies of his household of my noble lineage and refined manners, I kowtowed with all the grace of a veteran courtier and began the enumeration of their various virtues, excellencies, and charms of body and mind. When I had reached number 117, the victory was complete. They smiled. The Slim Lim remained obdurate. He gazed into vacancy for several moments and then pretended to fall asleep. I recited the purpose of my visit and waited patiently for the Lord of the Peacock Feather to deign to reply. He did so at last, but without opening his eyes, speaking as if half in a dream. Barbarian, son of a barbarian, grandson of a barbarian, great-grandson of a barbarian, great-great-grandson of a barbarian, great-great-great-grandson of a barbarian, so on, right? Well knowing that this was a mere ruse to waste the night in words, I resolved to put an end to it at once. I sat down and interrupted Slim Lim's long and dreary list by pretending to snore with that regularity which proves the accomplished sleeper. He came to a sudden halt. A deep silence now settled upon the scene, only broken by the nervous rattle of the ladies' fans. Slim Lim now began to realize that he had no ordinary mortal before him. For the first time he looked at me squarely in the face. The ladies grew alarmed at the dark cloud gathering on the brow of their liege lord and withdrew to the other end of the room. The Ta'utai was now wide awake. So was I. Bold, thoughtless, and ill-counseled stranger, he cried out, by the decree of the child of the sun, him of the sacred countenance, it is not lawful to punish a rash petitioner like thee, provided his prayer be one that may be granted. But what thou askest is impossible, for at this hour there is neither paper, ink, nor brush within the palace. Thou must suffer for thy rash conduct. Thou hast been cunning enough to pass the guards in coming hither, but already a score of pikes are leveled at thy breast. Escape is impossible, prepare for death. Our imprisonment in dungeon cell, which knows neither light nor warmth. To speak the truth, my legs bent beneath the weight of my body, as these cruel words made clear to me the danger I was in. I could see that tears had gathered in the eyes of the two gracious ladies standing near me. Paper, ink, brush, I murmured, half-dazed. Brush, paper, ink, or death? It must not be. I glanced about me. I closed my eyes. I fixed my gaze on Bulgar, but all in vain. No help came to me. A cold perspiration stood on my brow. Suddenly, a huge parrot, which was perched on a bamboo cage at one end of the room, uttered a harsh cry. Quicker than it takes to tell it, I called Bulgar to my side and set him teasing the bird. He was not averse to enter upon the sport. When it was well under way, I approached the bird from the rear, and as he bent forward to repel Bulgar's I deftly laid hold on one of his longest tail feathers and pulled it out. An ear-splitting yell went up, and the two ladies threw themselves towards their pet with 1,000 tearful expressions of pity and endearment. I now turned my attentions to Slim Lim. Drawing a pair of tiny shears from my pocket, I caught the end of his queue and snipped off an inch of it. My audacity struck him dumb. He could only stare at me with wide-opened mouth. I set to work now in good earnest. Drawing some silk threads from my sleeve, I fitted the hair into the quill with such nimble, cunning fingers that Slim Lim looked on quite awestruck. "The brush is ready, Lord of the Peacock Feather," I cried, laying it down in front of him. "And the paper too?" I continued, drawing out a paper mat from under a curio and turning up the white underside. He followed my movements as a child would those of a necromancer. Ink now was only lacking. With one of my most winning smiles, I drew near the ladies and thus addressed them. "Fasten forever the images of your beautiful faces upon the pages of my memory by lending me the jar of even pigment with which you add luster to those matchless arches that shade your eyes." They returned my smile with entrancing grace and sweetness, but what was more pleasing still, they granted my request. Halting for a moment at the cage of my friend, the parrot, who ruffled his feathers and eyed me most suspiciously, to moisten the pigment from his drinking vessel, I then strode with an air of triumph back to the table where Slim Lim sat nervously fanning himself, and said, "Most noble lord of the Peacock Feather, thy dull-witted, misshapen, and worthless slave hath prepared brush, ink, and paper. Deign to set thy most honorable sign manual to this paper, so that he may withdraw his poor, miserable body and limbs from beneath thy sacred roof." So saying, I held out the brush to Slim Lim. With trembling hand he took hold of it and rapidly traced the mysterious characters which were destined to open every gate and unbar every door until I stood once more on shipboard bound for my native land. Folding up the precious document, I thrust it into my sailor's pouch, but while I was flushed with victory, Slim Lim showed only too plainly that he was nearly beside himself with chagrin and vexation. The ladies of his household approached him with most profound obeisances and with loud and deep-drawn sighs at every step, but Slim Lim repulsed them in the rudest manner. He would have none other sympathy, none other pity or tender offices. They redoubled their efforts. Their sighs became more tender and louder. It was all in vain. Slim Lim was determined not to be propitiated. Turning to me, he cried out, "Let the barbarian, the son of a barbarian, the grandson of a barbarian, the great-grandson of a barbarian, the great-great-grandson of a barbarian, the great-great-great-grandson of a barbarian, the great-great-great-grandson of a barbarian, inscribe his wretched, worthless, mean, common, ordinary, insignificant, and despicable name upon a sheet of paper ere he goes forth, so that I and my children, and my children's children, and my children's children's children, and my children's 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 children may speak it with contempt." And then, in order to prove to me that he considered himself disgraced to sit in my presence, he threw himself full length upon the floor. Bulgar got it into his head that this strange proceeding was in some way a menace to me, for he walked cautiously around Slim Lim, sniffing at him and growling in a threatening way as if to say, "Don't play any tricks on my little master, or it will go hard with you." The ladies of Slim Lim's household were nearly crazed with grief and anxiety. I assured them of my protection, but this only seemed to increase their solicitation. To tell the truth, however, I was not half so calm as I appeared to be. Soul fate seemed to have woven her meshes about me once again. Slim Lim, with deep cunning, had set another task for me, which seemed so impossible of performance that he doubtless was already congratulating himself and applauding his own skillfully devised plan for holding me prisoner. He had demanded that I should write my name. Before going forth, he had been most careful to use the word write, so that I should not be permitted to use a brush after the manner of his people, but must have recourse to a pen after the manner of my own. Feeling pretty confident in his mind that I would not have a pen in my possession, he had ground for flattering himself that I was still in his power. Bulgar caught a glimpse of the shadow that had settled upon my face and whined nervously. A thought struck me. A quill will save me. I looked towards the parrot. Ah, deep-laid plan to rob me of my liberty. The bird had been removed from the room. The brush I had fashioned, the pigment, too, were gone. I could feel my knees grow weak. My breath came short and quick. A cold chill crept over me. There lay the Lord of the Peacock Feather, flat on his back, but as I turned my glance quickly upon him, I was sure that one of his eyes was half open and fixed upon me, while a faint ripple of a smile played in the corners of his mouth, most maliciously. "Ah, man of guile," thought I, "thou shalt not triumph, for I am about to shatter this last one of thy fetters, which thou dost think is already so firmly riveted upon my wrists. Thou art wise, and thou art subtle, but not so wise and not so subtle as the little baron who stands beside thee." "To me, Bulgar," I cried. With a single bound, he reached my side. "Take thy place there," I continued, pointing to Slim Lim's breast, "and if my enemy moves but the poor space of a narrow inch, do thy duty." Bulgar sprang lightly upon Slim Lim's breast, and with a low growl gave him to understand that there must be no trifling. Then my turn came to act. Whipping my pocket-knife out, I laid hold of Slim Lim's hand, and in less than a minute's time I cut a fine pin with an excellent nib on the end of the long nail of his little finger. Bulgar looked on, very much interested, giving a low growl every time Slim Lim showed the slightest indication of resenting the treatment to which I was subjecting him. My ink, that was a simple matter. Pricking my thumb with the point of my knife, I let a few drops of the crimson fluid collect on the palm of my hand. Then, reaching out for one of the paper mats, I dipped the pen, which now graced the little finger of the Lord of the Peacock Feather, and set my signature on the uncolored side of the mat in a neat, round hand. Bidding Bulgar descend from his post of honor, I now held out my hand to His Excellency, the Taotai, with these words: "Rise, Sir Knight of the plain red button, be generous as thou art noble. I have triumphed. Forgive my audacity. In my place thou wouldst have done likewise. Let thy enemy become thy friend, in birth noble, in letters learned, in arts skilled. He is more worthy of thy friendship than deserving of thy enmity." Slim Lim seized my hand and sprang to his feet with a good-humored smile on his broad face. "By the sacred countenance of the Child of the Sun, Lord of all the orders, thou art very clever for thy size," he exclaimed, as he conducted me to a seat. The ladies of the Taotai's household, who had retreated horror-stricken to their apartments, were now summoned to appear. Tea was brewed, and the Lord of the Peacock Feather insisted upon serving me with his own hands. I was almost crazed with joy at the thought of setting out for home under such happy auspices. Bulgar made friends with Slim Lim, and everybody forgave everybody. His Excellency, the Taotai, prevailed upon me to pass the night under his roof, assuring me that in the morning I should have a special escort, his own porte-chaise, and hampers packed in his own kitchen for my refreshment while on my journey to the seaport. Until a late hour, Slim Lim, the ladies of his household, Bulgar, and I gave ourselves up to feasting and merrymaking. In the morning I took my leave of the Taotai and his household in the happiest frame of mind. In a short week found me on board of a good staunch vessel, bound for home again. As the sails filled and we sped out of the harbor, I drew Bulgar to my breast, and the tears fell thick and fast. He licked my hands and face, and fixed his large, lustrous eyes full upon me. He could not, and I would not speak.